Oh wow.
Um, Hi everyone. Hi Daniel. I don't know like how long do you want to wait for people to arrive before we
A
start
few, a couple minutes.
the show?
I have 10:58 on
Right.
my phone and 11 in my computer, so maybe just a couple minutes, then we can get started. That's okay.
Sorry, I think I had the volume off here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can.
Yeah. Sorry, I have to turn off the
No,
icon.
I think it was here. Sorry.
Yeah, just a couple minutes and we should be good to go.
Okay, just let me know.
All right, great. Let me turn off the. Yeah, since a lot of people are showing up, so let's just give some time for people to jump in. Hmm.
By the way, sorry everyone for the late email invitation. Apparently the first one, the automatic one that should have went out when I created the seminar didn't work for some reason. Then we had to resend them. Thankfully, someone noticed and let us know. But normally we would send this email with like at least an hour of in advance.
We don't forgive you. It's unforgivable. No worries, Aaron. All right, I think yeah, we're good. We can get started.
Okay, I'll do
Oh, and
the
also say one
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Make sure, do you have the very latest version of the syllabus? Because I made a few modifications during the last few days.
The last version of what?
The syllabus for the description, because the description
Um, I downloaded it from Google Drive yesterday.
oh yeah,
So
great, yeah, that should be good. Perfect.
okay, um, let me. I'll have it open already here. So
That's
but well, then I'll start recording here and do the official presentation of the seminar. Okay, we're good. Hello everyone. Welcome to another seminar from New Center for Research and Practice. This seminar is titled the nature of the subject and the subject of nature, and it's going to be led by instructor Daniel Sacilotto. I don't know, sorry if I pronounced that right, or Danielle maybe. And it's part of the program of philosophy. And now I'm going to quickly read the description of the seminar. This seminar probes the vexed relationship between nature and subjectivity across the history of philosophy, from antiquity to the present. More precisely, we shall examine how, by thinking about these two concepts, philosophy articulates two theses that often appear in dramatic tension with each other. On the one hand, the thesis of the continuity between nature and the subject; on the other hand, the thesis of the uniqueness of the subject in the order of nature. The seminar focuses on the concomitant problems and controversies that emerge when one attempts to either assimilate one term into another or make the two terms autonomous. The first session details the historical background underlying this complex issue of nature versus subject across different epochs of thought. In the second session, we begin by attending to Aristotle's account of the formation of the ethical character in the Nicomachean Ethics, which essentially associates human subjectivity with practical wisdom, and the latter with a kind of second nature. Attesting to the second nature requires expanding notions of causation. Maybe here it says notions causation. Expanding notions of causation beyond the realm of natural law, so that rather than localizing the rational kernel of the subject outside of nature in a kind of supernaturalism or reducing the latter to natural, such an account proposes to amplify our conception of nature and causation, to accommodate the practical life of thinking beings within it. In the second session, we see how philosophical modernity recodes this problematic in various epistemological and metaphysical attempts to coordinate the concepts of mind and body. First, Descartes' substance dualist account of the cogito and extension. Second, Spinoza's coordination of a property dualism of extension and thinking, and a substance monism that distinguishes between nature as self-determined or productive, natura naturans, and as derivative or produced, natura naturata. And third, Kant's transcendental idealist attempt to assimilate nature to subjectivity in his account of representational cognition and his simultaneous separation of nature as representation and the real as unrepresentable. Fourth, Schelling's attempt to coordinate thinking and being by way of transcendental materialism that supplements and undercuts the skeptical and idealist consequences of critical philosophy. In the fourth session, we look at two attempts to reincorporate subject into nature at the end of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century by proposing a genealogical critique of Enlightenment rationality.
Excuse me, can I interrupt you very briefly?
Yeah, just like I don't know if you want me to read because it's a particularly long introduction.
Yeah, well, that's also not the latest version.
Oh,
So
okay. Sorry. So the syllabus has a new version of this.
yeah,
Sorry,
there has a new yes,
I
yes.
was reading from the site.
Yeah, it's strange because I uploaded the latest version like
No,
a few days ago.
sorry. I was reading from the new center site just
Oh,
because
from the new
like
center side. Yeah, that's completely out of date, and that's full of typos and crap because they edited on their own accord. Yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sorry. I'm sorry. I thought you meant the syllabus for later for the for
No, for
organizing
that
the
one
whole
for the
system.
OneDrive, that's the latest, the one that's in the class folder. That's the last one, but I can
Okay.
send
No,
it.
I have it. I have it open here as well. So
All right, great, great, great.
should I continue like from
Go
where
to
I stopped?
fourth session. Yeah, just in the fourth session, we look at two attempts to adapt.
Yeah.
Hopefully, that's
Uh,
yeah.
In the fourth session, we look at two attempts to adapt Platonist and naturalist conceptions of the subject to the ideal of the new materialism of a new materialism alongside rationalist and empiricist lines. Alain Badiou's dialectical materialism and its historical structuralist account of subjectivity in theory of the subject, and Gilles Deleuze's transcendental empiricism and its account of larval subjectivation in difference and repetition. In the fifth session, we focused on Wilfrid Sellars' distinction between the manifest and scientific images of man in the world, in the context of thinking of a speculative anthropology that details man's self-conception in its relation to the natural world. As we shall see, Sellars' definition between the images maps two ways of articulating the bind between causes and reasons, or more precisely, between the order of causal regularities, which understands man as a complex physical system, and the logical space of reasons, which understands man within the framework of persons. And while Sellars follows Kant's understanding of cognition as a normative structure, we shall argue he also follows Aristotle's idea that our concept of nature and naturalism must be amplified to include subjectivity within our scientific worldview. In the sixth session, we attend to how Sellars' naturalism with a normative turn gives way to the divide to, to
Yeah,
divergent. Sorry.
no, never mind. Keep going.
Okay. To gives way to the divide to divergent orientations of thought. First, so-called left Sellarsians avow Sellars' normative account of thinking, but take issue with his naturalism, and those right Sellarsians that avow the naturalist thesis of integrating man into nature, but take issue with the naturalist views. As an example of the former orientation, we focus on how John McDowell proposes to rehabilitate Aristotle's distinction between first and second nature in his magnum opus Mind and World, so as to declare the necessity of incorporating normativity into our conceptions of nature so as to avoid the perils of both a bald naturalism that fails to account for subjectivity and of a rampant Platonism that reifies subjectivity metaphysically in dualist or idealist key. As an example of the second orientation, we focus on Paul Churchland's proposal of a eliminativist materialism that reduces the framework of persons and intentionality to the domain of causes within a neurobiological register, thereby collapsing norms onto nature and on Gualtiero Piccini's computationalist account of cognition. In the seventh session, we see how more recently many thinkers on seventh session we see how more recently many thinkers have sought to find new conciliatory paths between a naturalism that reduces subjectivity to the causal order and a normativism that replaces subjectivity beyond nature altogether. We focus on two such attempts. First, Joseph Rouse's Articulating the World, Conceptual Understanding and the Scientific Image, which follows the Sallarsian attempt to amplify our conceptions of nature so as to account for the normativity of thought, without thereby indulging in reductionism tracing a diagonal across the debates in the philosophy of mind and heeding to recent advances in contemporary life sciences. Second, Adrian Johnson's synthetic work Second Natures in Dappled Worlds, which attempts to problematize the very normativist conception of subjectivity that describes the latter as a rational being as much as the mechanistic views of nature that describe causal laws as reducible to efficient mechanisms, drawing from the works of Nancy Cartwright, Jacques Lacan, and Catherine Malabou. Finally, Johanna Seib's attempt to develop Seller's process metaphysics through the resources of dynamic systems theory to pursue a monist ontology and a naturalization of consciousness and its normative content. In the eighth and final session, we observed certain attempts in post-humanist philosophy to traverse of the piety of an anthropocentrism or humanism that reifies subjectivity as somehow an exception to nature, better to reconceive of a subjectivity that uproots itself from the natural order as it intervenes upon the latter technically, transforming itself in the process. We focus on Scott Baker's critique of Adrian Johnston and the intentional stance, and Ray Bercier's defense of transcendental naturalism, where the transformation of subjectivity in the wake of techno-cognitive transformation, but also in scientific and mathematical sciences, involves a shift in our conception of nature and the relation between the two. Okay, so this is the outline and introduction of the seminar. Now I should read Daniel Sacilotto's profile. Should I read it from the site? I have it open here, but I don't know if you have.
No, that's
also
fine. Yeah,
okay.
That's fine.
Daniel Sacilotto is a PhD in comparative literature from the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. His research focuses on the fields of contemporary philosophy and Latin American literature. In particular, his research focuses on the reconciliation of rationalism and materialism and the methodological relation between epistemology and ontology in contemporary philosophy. He is currently finishing a full-length monograph tentatively titled Saving the Noumenon, an essay on the foundations of ontology, in which he proposes a critical reading of the ontological term in contemporary philosophy, and lays the foundations for a new transcendental epistemology, chiefly inspired in the works of Wilfrid Sellars, Robert Brandom, Alain Badiou, Laurence Pontel, Ray Brazier, Reza Negarestani, and Jay Rosenberg. Okay, so welcome again, everyone, for this first session. We should have now an introduction by Danielle. My name is Antonio. I'm going to be moderating the seminar, and I also remind everyone that by the end of this session, we should have an organized distribution of the presentations of each of the texts that are in the syllabus. So if you guys want to start thinking meanwhile about which subject is more interesting to you, we should try to save some time at the end or whenever Danielle prefers to organize this. Okay, so I pass the mic to Professor Daniel Sacilotto.
Thank you. And sorry for there were some synchronization issues. The description in the website is not the same as it is in the syllabus in its current shape. I just uploaded the latest version of the syllabus, which is far more polished. I don't know why the New Center sometimes edits the syllabus on its own accord. The course description, for example, in the website says nature of subject and subject of nature, but it's the subject. Of course, it's a technical term. In any case, the latest version of the syllabus is uploaded at present. So make sure that during the break, I mean, we'll take a short break so that everybody can just sort of download the latest version and take a look at it in the interest of setting up presentations for the weeks to come. But we'll do that towards the end, okay? So what I want to do today is roughly, well, obviously introduce the class, the concept behind the class. I have something prepared, a kind of introductory historical and conceptual presentation to do. But as usual, you know, one of the first things we should do is introduce ourselves first, you know, and sort of say who we are, what our background in philosophy is, please. I know a fair amount of you, but not everybody. So just tell me who you are, tell the class who you are, what kind of philosophical formation, if any, you have, and what's your interest in the class. That way I have an idea of how to navigate the exposition a little better. So let's, there's a lot of people in the class. It's a rather large group. So let's try to make this swift so we can get to business as soon as possible. But I'll go by just the order in which I see people. So I'll just start calling people out. Please just start speaking when I call you out. So let's start with Aaron Marcus. Oh, I think Aaron can speak. Yeah, he says that I won't be able to speak. So we'll leave Aaron for next time. Alex Cruz, and please correct me if I mispronounce your name.
Hi, everyone. No, the pronunciation was great. Thanks. And my name is Alex. I'm based in Oakland, California. I use any gender pronouns. I am an artist and a writer. I don't have a particular philosophical background, but I am interested in discourses around post-humanism. So yeah, very excited for the course. And thanks so much.
Welcome. Alex McQueen. Alex, are you there? Oh, okay. He has to step away for a sec. All right, so let's just keep going and then we'll come back to you, Alex. Alvin?
Yeah, hey, Alvin, and I'm a writer and curator based in Shanghai. I also don't really come from a philosophy background, but I guess what brought me here is interest in like eco-criticism and some subjects that will be covered in this seminar.
Fantastic, thank you. Welcome. Then we have Angelos Papadopoulos.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. I'm based in Athens, Greece. I'm a dance artist, a performer and choreographer and director. I've also studied economics, and I don't have like a professional or academic relationship with philosophy, but I'm really interested, especially in the subject issue and how also that can be connected to the naturalism and everything. So yes, I read a lot, and I'm trying to bring these thoughts in the primal material of the body. That's all for now.
Oh, thank you and welcome. Then we have Burns.
Hey, my name is Dana. It shows up as Burns, but I kind of like it. I'm based in New York. I am a writer and a poet. I'm interested in kind of broadly in philosophy of language, as well as maybe how that can pertain to building a philosophical framework for the future of animal rights and animal husbandry.
Thank you, welcome. Then we have Carl.
Yeah, hi, I'm a cultural geographer of some kind based in Newcastle in England and in Gothenburg in Sweden, a bit of both. I'm trying to finish my PhD, and yeah, I'm interested in putting some of the resources that we will be talking about a bit later during the seminar from sort of philosophical naturalism to work in cultural geography to think about these questions from our kind of perspective as well. Yeah, so. Nice to meet everyone.
And welcome back. Then we have Daryl Campbell.
Yes, yes. Hello. Sorry, I can't get my video going, but I'll have to bow out in the break and see if I can get it going. I've got a master's in arts and integrated studies. I'm mainly interested in continental philosophy, Lacan, lots of Badiou that I've read. Deleuze, the likes of that, and a few courses from New Center.
Sorry, just 1 second too. There's a construction site right outside of me, which makes it extremely annoying. Welcome back, Daryl. Then we have Everim.
I'm based in Istanbul, Turkey. I have a background in continental philosophy. I wrote my master thesis on Levinas, and I think this is my 6th or 7th seminar at the New Center now.
Welcome back. Jared. Jared, are you there?
Yeah, I was just muted.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jared. I am a bartender based in Fayetteville, Arkansas, up in that northwest corner. I have some background in philosophy through the rhetoric department of UC Berkeley, mainly tradition of critical genealogy, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Foucault, Freud, and then through some independent research toward the end of that term, and then just ongoing, lots of reading in Deleuze, and then New Center courses, mainly with Daniel, and then one with Reza and Adam. Recently been reading into the most maybe extreme or very exciting tendency lately with Spinal Catastrophism by Thomas Moynihan. And here to, I don't know, satisfy my curiosity in related topics.
Welcome back. Then we have Koroleva.
Yeah, that's me. My name is Maria. I'm in Moscow. I'm an art critic, and I studied philosophy first as a linguist. This is my first education, and then as an artist, and then as an art critic. I have read both Badiou and Deleuze. I know continental philosophy, but analytical not so much. But I'm interested in it as well.
Cool. Thank you very much, and welcome. Then we have Lucas Braga.
Hi, I'm based in São Paulo. I graduated in philosophy. Now I'm a writer, and I'm interested in contemporary philosophy, philosophy of nature, and phenomenology.
Phenomenal. Welcome. Then we have Matthew Golden.
Hi, my name is Matthew. I am a comedian. I'm based in Los Angeles. I have no formal education in philosophy, but I'm very interested in post-humanist philosophy and neo-rationalism. So, yeah.
Welcome. Then we have Peter Eid. Please help me with that one.
Yeah, Eid is correct.
Great.
Yeah. So you can hear me?
Yes.
My name is Peter Eid. I come from Melbourne, Australia. It's 5 a.m. in the morning here. So some dedication to philosophy right there. I am also a PhD student at Monash University, and my PhD is on science fiction, on an Australian science fiction writer. And previously, I did a master's thesis on the work of Alain Badiou called Alain Badiou and the Linguistic Turn, which effectively was a kind of looked at the contemporary rationalist critique of post-structuralism. And so my interest in philosophy is kind of goes back a little while, and I'm currently somewhat of a student at the New Center in the critical philosophy section.
Cool. Welcome.
Thank you.
Then we have Rafael Pedroso.
Hello, I am Rafael. I am a student of international relations. I'm a master's student now, and I have no sort of like structured education in philosophy. I mainly got my way through political theory. My main interest for my dissertation is on linking the Anthropocene and the crisis of value through the works of Marx and his engagement with like a little bit of an engagement with value form theory and also the theory of thermodynamics within Marx and the questions of employment and the concept of labor itself. So I try to retrieve this sort of scientific materialism from Marx's time and try to get it into practice right now, pretty much.
Welcome. And finally, we have Suzanne Cass.
Yeah, hi. So I have studied conceptual art, and at the moment I'm starting a PhD in media and communications at the social sciences faculty at Charles University in Prague, and I'm going to be doing working on how embodied environmental knowledge is coming into conflict with mediated information about the environment. And so I'm interested also in different ontologies and how that kind of plays into how people construct their environmental knowledge.
Welcome. Then I just got a message from Julia Resende. Hi, Daniel, I'm here as well. My name is Julia. I have no background in philosophy, early students, psychoanalysis. So, oh, Regis. Yeah, I just saw Regis show up. So, Regis, I can see you. Maybe just a few names kept showing up, but let me see if I missed somebody. Julia, do you want, I mean, can you, is your camera and your mic efficient so you can introduce yourself? Just to the group. If not, then, well, we can read on the side. Not sure. Oh, maybe, yes, there are 6 other people in the attendees list, and I don't know if they have the capacity to introduce themselves through video. If you are enrolled in the course and you need to, I think you just need to join the class through as a panelist so that you can take part of it. But Regis, can you introduce yourself? I think you do appear in the panelist list.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. My name is Regis or Regis, and I'm based in São Paulo, Brazil. And I think this is my 4th or 5th seminar in your center. And I'm graduated in philosophy. I'm finishing my dissertation now on Hegel's Science of Logic. And I'm applying for PhD also. I want to study logic and metaphysics in Hegel and Schelling. So the subject of the relation between subject and nature is very important to me. Yeah.
Great. Welcome back. And I think I see Alan joined. He is in the panelist list. Alan, are you there? Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Alan. I'm from Mexico City. I have a background in architecture originally, but also like in critical theory, some media studies. Yeah, I've been with the new center for quite a while now, following Daniel's seminars, which are always really good. And yeah, I'm interested in the topics of the class. Well, I'm interested in the philosophical naturalism that comes from the Salesian school. But I would also like to think about how, what I think from what it was mentioned, maybe in the last session we'll see some of this, but I'm interested on the role of techniques or technology in the relationship between the subject and nature. So, yep, that's all.
Thank you and welcome. So I still see 7 people in the attendance list. If you again are part of the seminar, you're enrolled in the seminar, and you just make sure that you join the panelist list. And after our short break, we will give a chance for any people that show up to introduce themselves at that point. Let me just ask Alex, are you back? Do you want to just introduce yourself at this point? If you are back.
Sure, yeah, I'm back now.
Cool.
Yeah, so I'm Alex. I sort of have a long-standing interest in philosophy, but I don't have any formal education in it. My primary interests, I guess, are in contemporary French philosophy, particularly Deleuze and Badiou, and the philosophy of science. And so I'm particularly interested in this seminar in like the history of the notion of nature, how that gets constructed and articulated in various ways, and in particular how that plays out in our philosophical conceptions of natural science.
And welcome. Okay, great. It's a very large group. It's actually the largest class that I've had so far. I mean, I don't know how many people will stick around, but it is a very large group. So we'll have to definitely be very good with setting up like the structure of presentations and all that. For today's purposes, I want to introduce the class in a broad manner. Also, there's a lot of people in the class that don't have a formal training or any background in philosophy, which means that I will have to be sometimes more pedagogical and introductory than some of you who have the sort of larger, deeper background in philosophy might find appeasing, but it's going to be necessary to be democratic in that regard. So what I want to do today is basically introduce the concept of the course. Let me just start by saying a few very, very general things concerning why this class. Last time that I did one of these things, the last seminar I taught, I began by a biographical note, but I think it's interesting to always understand what motivates the instructor to do what they're doing. And in this case, so the question of naturalism on nature, the relationship between nature and subjectivity is a question that overlaps with a lot of the philosophical work that I've been doing for the last several years in my own work. It is a topic that, again, overlaps with many concerns proper to the so-called analytic and continental philosophical traditions. If you're not terribly familiar with that distinction, it doesn't matter really too much for now. We'll get to that. We'll have a chance to just briefly address that at some point. But long story short, it is a question that covers a lot of philosophical terrain, many different philosophical traditions, and the concept of the subject, for those of you who are not familiar with this little piece of technical jargon, is a concept that features prominently in the history of philosophy, at least since the modern period, but which has come under considerable stress ever since, and has been subject to various formulations and iterations. No different than nature. Our conceptions of nature have changed a great deal, and how we conceive of nature and the very concept of nature is rather broadly defined, and so on. So what I want to do today is first give a sort of conceptual and historical brief introduction to a cluster of problems, issues, and distinctions that we're going to be addressing in the seminar as we move forward in a kind of crass and general manner, just to give us a feel for the texture that the course will take. And what I will do then is just try to give you a brief rundown for how I conceive of syllabus. But one of the things that I wanted to say, just as a note of biographical introduction, as it were, is that I have been engaged in the last, I want to say maybe 5, 6, 7 years in this long book project, which is now basically complete, but it's being reviewed and edited and so on and so forth. But this project follows from a particular philosophical tradition of Salarsian philosophy. That is to say, a school of philosophy or a tradition of philosophy that follows from the work of a philosopher named Wilfrid Sellars, who we will have a chance to talk about and read in the seminar. But it's a project that attempts precisely to reconcile two very, very divergent conceptions of subjectivity. Well, maybe not as divergent as one would like to think, but normally posed against each other. And we'll talk more about that today as well. One which is quote unquote a transcendental conception of the subject, and I'll have more to say about what that exactly means, and another a naturalist conception of the subject. We'll have more to say about that as well. But in this tension, or in this attempt to reconcile these divergent orientations or conceptions of the subject, I found myself not only having to negotiate between different strands of Salarsian philosophy proper, but also finding a way to integrate insights from different philosophical traditions that are very remote from Salarsian philosophy, strictly speaking. And I have personally a background in both analytic and continental philosophy. I am from Peru. I grew up in Peru. I started my philosophical education in a continental philosophy department. I transferred to the US, to Cornell, to a analytic philosophy department where I finished my degree. And I am a comparative literature PhD, where my dissertation was largely a reading of Peruvian socialist indigenista philosophy and literature and contemporary French philosophy, prominently the work of Badiou and others. So it's a pretty hectic background, but my philosophical research, as I mentioned, centers on this question about an attempt to articulate these two conceptions of subjectivity, a naturalist and a transcendental conception of subjectivity. And so in the context of trying to work that out, I had to not only sort of survey a great body of literature that covers a lot of different traditions, but it gave me some clarity with regards to a number of collateral problems that circumvent this vexed question about the relationship between subjectivity and nature and how to conceive of the subject in nature or as part of nature and so on. So that's just roughly speaking a very, very crass introduction to how I came to think of these issues. And I think that one thing that will come out, we will be reading a rather vast and varied corpus of philosophical literature from different periods and traditions and schools and so on. And there will be a series of conceptual distinctions that will be drawn as the course proceeds. And one of the things I want to do today, roughly, is to introduce us to some of these basic conceptual distinctions that will animate the course, as well as the fundamental questions that will be raised throughout the course. So that's just as a matter of very general introduction. Any provisional questions or comments or thoughts that anybody wants to throw in there? Probably not. It's very crass at this point. So what I want to do now, if you allow me, is to project something that I prepared. I have a presentation, an introductory presentation that can help us navigate this terrain. So you make sure that there's nothing going on in the panel that I need to attend to. Attendees, no, it seems to be all good. And we will, as I mentioned, take a sort of short break during the middle so that people can download the latest version of the syllabus and start looking at what they would like to present and so on. But before we get to any administrative boring stuff, let me just get started with some introductory expository stuff. Okay, so let me just give me one brief second. I need to be given host privileges to project, please.
Okay. I should go to your name here probably, right?
Yeah, I think you just right click up. Yeah, make host or co-host. Make me co-host, and that way you retain yours as well.
Yeah, okay, I'll try to do that because I don't know if it's going to affect the recording.
Oh, okay.
Okay, but I don't see co-host here, just host. I think I just make you host. I think usually that's what we do, right?
I don't know.
Yeah, but I don't see co-host option. I think I have to make you host.
Okay.
There you go. Daniel is host now.
Great. Voila, there we go. Okay, let me see if this is working now. Great. So are you seeing the PowerPoint? Yes? I need a nod. Okay,
yeah,
Regis.
Yes,
I can see it.
Phenomenal. Thank you very much. So first, let me begin by formulating the essential question. I always have this sort of, we begin from the general and then we start descending into the particulars, start picking away at the actual question. So obviously the question that we all know we are in this for is, how is philosophy to think of the relationship between subjectivity and nature, these two concepts? But immediately, of course, this question divides into two questions, very constitutive questions, which make up the two halves that the title expresses. First, what is the nature of the subject? And second, is subjectivity part of nature or somehow separated from it, right? Now, the first thing that I want to say is that in these two questions, which make up, of course, the two halves of the title, the term nature is being used in two different senses clearly. So this is the first thing. There's a bit of a sleight of hand in this locution, the nature of the subject and the subjective nature. And this already points towards one issue, which seems at first merely a matter of terminological divergence, but it turns out to be more substantive and more interesting than it might seem at first. So in the first sense, we have what I call nature one, just to keep track, keep a scorebook here, an attributive sense of nature. And this is the sense in which nature appears in the first locution, what is the nature of the subject, right? In this sense, when we speak about the nature of a thing, we're talking about what it is that defines that thing. In classical hylomorphism or essentialist philosophy, this would be the form or the essence of a thing. Or in a more contemporary context, we might speak, for example, of the necessary and sufficient conditions for the individuation of a thing. That is to say, the set of properties or the set of descriptions on whose basis we can say that a thing is defined as what it is and distinguished therefore from everything else. So this is a first attributive sense of nature, the nature of a thing as what defines it, either in essentialist terms, the form, the essence, the intrinsic quality, or in terms of the necessary and sufficient conditions for its individuation, right? In the second sense, we have a substantive notion of nature. Oh, and I keep seeing more things pop up in the chat. I don't think, okay, I'm gonna ignore this for now because it seems to be administrative issues with panels, okay? So I'll check back in a little bit. The second sense, the substantive sense, which I call nature two, is the sense in which nature appears in the second question. Is subjectivity part of nature or somehow separate from it? So nature as such, nature, maybe if you want with a capital N, considered as a domain of being or even as the domain of beings as a whole. Nature nominally understood. Now, this very basic distinction between these first two senses of nature already lead us into some provisional propedeutic methodological questions, right? The first question is that in the attributive sense, in the first sense, nature one, the question about the definitional criteria, how we define nature, the sense of nature, how we define the nature of a thing, can be understood either in an ontological or an epistemological sense. And what does this mean? When we speak of the nature of a thing, are we talking about something that is in the world, something real, right? Are natures, when we say the nature of X or Y, natural kinds themselves, are they part of nature too? Are natures one parts of nature too that belong to nature as a constituent of reality? Or are natures purely nominal, definitional, heuristic devices that are relative to discursive or pragmatic factors? This goes back to this distinction that I already laid out between an essentialist, maybe perhaps, definition of natures in the attributive sense and a purely nominal one. So we can say that, for example, when we define the nature of a tree as being, constituting of the properties, it is a plant, it is a living being, it has it has branches and roots and so on and so forth, right? This is the definition that defines the nature of a tree. This is, however, this can be understood, however, either in a substantive ontological sense, in which we say, yes, the nature of the thing, these properties that define its essential characteristics are part of the thing itself. They are out there in the world. They are part of what defines this thing as it is. Essences are in the world. Natures are themselves natural kinds. Or we can say, well, no, there are different ways to chop the pie, as it were. Reality comes in us as this big flux of whatever, and we, definitionally distinguish things from other things on the basis of specific pragmatic criteria that we have, on the basis of specific theoretical orientations or frameworks that we might like to inhabit, but these hold a purely instrumental or purely pragmatic valence or value, and they should not be read as corresponding to anything in the world, properly speaking, or in any case, they should be understood as devices that we use to explain the world as such, but not anything be more lofty than that. So this is what I mean by a distinction between the ontological and an epistemological sense of the attributive sense of nature. So there's a bigger question here concerning how we define the concept of a natural kind, which is something that takes us a little bit deeper into waters belonging to Aristotelian philosophy and essentialist philosophy and substance metaphysics. I will not get into that right now. It is in the slideshow as a brief indication of where we're going, right? But just keep it in the back of the mind. So with regards to the latter definition, the substantive definition, when we speak of nature with a capital N, right? Nature as a domain of being, or as that domain of being as a whole. We have a subsidiary question as well, which is nature the singular domain of being, or one domain among many domains of being? And this is a question that pertains to what is famously called in philosophy the problem of ontological univocity or plurivocity. Is being said in one sense or in more than one senses? Is there such a thing as non-natural being? Is there a difference between being and nature, or are they equivalent, semantically equivalent, right? Another way to formulate this, for those of you who are more familiar perhaps with the Heideggerian kind of jargon, and we'll get to, I'll have a little bit to say about this. Is nature a domain of being in the sense of a region of entities that we can say, for example, nature comprises those beings that exist that are physical, chemical, biological, and so on. But then there is also social being or cultural being, and that comprises another set of entities, money and parties and whatever, but that is not nature, strictly speaking. Nature is reserved as one domain among many others. Or maybe perhaps nature is not to be identified just as a domain of being, but is to be identified more primitively, not as a region of being, but as the way that being is opened up in all of these different domains. In other words, nature is not a domain of beings or entities, the physical, the biological, the chemical, but it is actually the way in which being becomes disclosed in all possible ways. This is actually the Heideggerian conception, which he traces back to the Greek term physis. And for him, the originary concept of nature, as we'll see, further down the line, is not a concept that has to do with a empirical or scientific investigation into a domain, like the natural sciences, for example, but it has to do with a more primitive ontological rather than ontic disclosure of being. Now, this is all very jargony, I understand, so it doesn't have to mean much. It's just to indicate some subsidiary problems. So the original two questions that I formulated with which we begin take us to a few definitional and methodological questions. And this takes us to obviously a propedeutic question, and a question that really we have to begin by asking. And this is kind of where I'm going to go today, trying to clarify this a little bit further. And the question, the subsidiary question that articulates this methodological propedeutic issue is, what criteria constrain our definitions of subjectivity and of nature? Under what criteria do we define these terms? And the first thing that we can intuitively realize is that we can define the term subject and nature more or less restrictively, kind of as we please, but it depends on the kinds of ability. When we talk about the subject, it's going to depend on the kinds of abilities, the kinds of properties, the kinds of beings that we want to include and we take to be sufficient for subjectivity, for something like subjectivity to emerge. And here we can take a more restrictive or less restrictive definition, rather arbitrarily, and philosophers have indeed done so throughout the history of philosophy. So we can say that subjectivity requires pure, reliable, differential responsiveness to environmental inputs. So to be a subject means simply to be able to respond differentially to environmental inputs by issuing outputs in a kind of reliable manner. That is the most sort of lax possible definition of subjectivity you can give. This, of course, will lead to a kind of what is called panpsychism, in which every kind of regularity in nature, any kind of regular behavior in nature, turns out to be an expression of subjectivity. We can define it as problem solving, which already might be a more narrow definition. What solves problems? For example, plants seem to solve problems insofar as their patterns of growth, the branching of roots, seem to obey particular strategies, we would say, right? For example, accessing a path towards light so as to trigger photosynthesis or something like that. And insofar as problem solving is something that we might want to say constitutes a kind of agency, it might constitute subjectivity, or it might be sufficient for subjectivity. That's a slightly more restrictive definition, but it's still a fairly broad distinction that would include as parts of as subjects entities that we might not intuitively think are necessarily subjects. However, we will see this is actually a very old conception that you see already in Aristotle, for example, in which, you know, plants and other, let's call them mindless beings, have souls, and so a kind of agency of some kind. However, not agency in the sense in which we associate it with discursive cognition, but a very different kind of agency. So we're going to talk about that as well, obviously. Moving forward, in a more restrictive sense, we can say, okay, well, no, subjectivity is restricted to those beings that have consciousness. And by consciousness, we can roughly mean here sentient awareness, what we share with non-human animals, right? We have a sensory perception of our environments. We have an integrated field or simulation of our environments. We are aware, we are conscious, right? So maybe that is what it means to be a subject, right? So subjectivity, the threshold in which subjects emerge, is the threshold of consciousness. Okay, that's an even more restrictive definition. Now the plans are out of the window, but you know, we need not just problem solving, not just conscious, not just problem solving in the sense that we attribute to plans, but consciousness in the sense of something like a simulation of the environment in the way that sentient creatures have. Even more restrictively, we can say, no, actually subjects are only those beings that are endowed with something like conceptual discursive cognition, deliberative cognition, rationality, you name it, right? Man is the rational animal, the subject is the transcendental subject. This is a very common and very popular conception of subjectivity, very prominent conception of subjectivity. We're going to talk more about this as well, that says that actually humans are unique in the order of nature, or even separated from the order of nature insofar as they are subjects, that it is their subjectivity that creates a kind of exception or cut within nature that separates them from the rest of it, and that the status of the subject is precisely to be this kind of exceptional being. And this exceptional being has to do with its rational, discursive, normative capacities. Now, why? It's because, well, a variety of reasons why, you know, people would want to take such a restrictive definition, but among many other of the reasons is because it is considered to be that only subjects can be free in the sense of engaging in a process that expresses agency. And agency requires the capacity to assume epistemic states, beliefs, to engage in patterns of justification for these beliefs, and therefore to engage in what is called deliberative cognition. Freedom requires deliberative cognition requires language, and language requires the capacity, or it incarnates the capacity of giving and asking for reasons, embedding as entering a space of dialogical deliberative consciousness that is social, that is distributed, and it is this that defines the human subject. Okay, I mean, this is a familiar conception that goes back, you know, to the ancient Greeks, and it's reiterated in different periods of philosophical history. We see it today in quote unquote neo-rationalist approaches. But then there's an even more restrictive conception on this, believe it or not. There is the conception of that, you know, even deliberative cognition is low-hanging fruit, that we only are subjects in these rare moments when we raise beyond the human animal that we are, and we engage in something like processes of deep creation or genius. The romantic conception of genius, for example, is one in which the revolutionary conception of subjectivity is born, in which we become subjects when we engage in these rare moments of creation. And contemporary versions of this exist. For example, many of you are familiar with the work of Alain Badiou, who we will also be reading, but Badiou has a particularly a particularly rarefied conception of the subject. The subject is rare, is an exception. We are not subjects by virtue of having language. We are subjects, if we ever are, by virtue of engaging in processes that are of a creative and revolutionary nature, in politics, in science, in the arts, in love. But this is the most exclusionary, or the most, let's say, rarefied and restrictive, narrow conception of the subject. So in this like series of ever more restrictive or broader definitions, we see a variety of iterations and conceptions being developed across philosophical history. And I just like list a few of these conceptions in the slide. The subject in the Greek soul, and the subject as hypokaimenon, which means ground. The Cartesian ego cogito, which I presume most of us are familiar with. Kant's I think, the transcendental subject. Spinoza's God substance. Hegel's absolute subject. Husserl's transcendental ego. Lacan's barred subject. Deleuze's larval subject. Badiou's subject of truth. So there are all these iterations and formulations of the subject. They're very different, both in scope, range, and in its particularities. Of course, I'm not going to go through each of them right now, but we're going to be surveying a lot of these conceptions. So one of the questions that I want us to interrogate is trying to tease precisely what criteria do these people follow in order to define their conceptions of the subject more or less restrictively, right? How it is, in other words, we're trying to tease out the methodological criteria which can help us assess this question of how it is that we should define subjectivity. Well, the same obviously applies to the concept of nature, right? We can understand nature more or less restrictively. So for example, we can define nature as it is today when we speak of naturalism as the domain of being that is investigated by the natural sciences. This is what naturalism is normally understood in a philosophical register formally. But more broadly, some people would say that natural being is simply that which is equivalent. So this is a narrower, broader definition, the empirical domain. Anything that can be investigated empirically belongs to nature in some way or other. Even cultural being, even what we explore through the social sciences or in the humanities and history, whatever. All of this is part of nature after all, because, you know, under a suitably large definition, nature includes not only the kinds of entities described by natural sciences, but also those by social sciences and who knows what else, right? And even more, you can say it's a narrower definition perhaps, being as disclosed to the senses or thought. Nature is being as represented. For example, Kant's conception says that nature is not actually the world out there, but it is equivalent to the domain of represented being, how being appears to us. And that everything that we say about the world, about nature, is actually a matter of describing how it is that representations of the world hang together, how it is that appearances hang together. Okay, so that's another conception. Then we have the conception, of course, of nature as actually coeval with God and its products, right? This is the Spinoza's conception, which has its quote unquote sequel in the transcendental physics of Schelling. The distinction between natura naturans and natura naturata. I'm not going to get into this again for reasons of time, but anyway, long story short, we have this possibility to define nature in a variety of ways, right? And one of the things that, of course, comes out of this simple point, I suppose, which is about the definitional criteria that we use, is that we also, just like we want to interrogate the nature of the subject, we also have to interrogate the nature of nature, the nature one of nature two, right? When we speak about what it is, what the criteria, definitional criteria is to understand what nature is as such. So the nature of the subject and the nature of nature are both necessary propedeutic questions before we can articulate the relationship between the two. And the other thing that is important in this regard, and something that we will have much more to say, is that just like our conceptions of the subject change in time, obviously throughout these like different broad and narrow senses, they diachronically change also in in its broadest scope, so that we change our understanding of what nature is radically. We go from understanding nature under, for example, a mechanistic paradigm of causation in the natural sciences to one in which we include non-mechanistic forms of dynamics or regularities or whatever you want, or patterns, right? So it is not only that we can define it more or less restrictively, synchronically, depending on our interest, theoretical perspectives, and so on, but there's also a diachronic development of the concept of nature within, for example, the exploration given to it through the natural sciences, right? Our conceptions of nature change as our science itself changes and matures and so on. I don't need to tell you how this occurs because it's fairly obvious, but we're going to look at it specifically how it is that certain changes in our historical scientific development lead to problematizations concerning the concept of nature, and how these problematizations actually allow us perhaps to integrate the concept of subjectivity, whereas there was perhaps a tension seen between the mechanistic conception of nature on the one hand, and on the other hand, human agency, in the sense that it includes these complex patterns of reason, giving, and intentional behavior that do not seem to fit neatly into a mechanistic framework. Well, perhaps a different conception of nature that moves beyond a mechanistic understanding of it can help us accommodate nature, subjectivity into nature, and vice versa. So this is obviously looking ahead, but I'm just throwing out there a few of these like broad-ranging questions. So okay, so this is very, very abstract and very, very high-hanging fruit, as it were, but this leads to a series of subsidiary conceptual distinctions that will be animating the class, and a series of questions also that will be animating the class. So what I want to do now is just present to you a few of these subsidiary questions. Some of them are very similar to each other and subtly different, but in the subtle differences, you also see differences of emphasis in research programs, in backgrounds, and traditions. So it's actually kind of interesting to take a look at this. The first one that I want to start looking at, this is a rather contemporary distinction between two questions that embed the relationship between subjectivity and nature. And this is what are called the emergence and the demarcation questions. And roughly saying, I'll just read from the top, the demarcation question first. The demarcation question concerns how we define the nature of the subject. What differentiates subjectivity from the rest of nature, if anything at all? This is famously a locution was systematized by the philosopher Robert Brandom, the definition of the subject in purely abstract terms that allows us to say where the subject begins and the rest of nature, in fact, ends. Okay? How to separate or differentiate conceptually the subject in nature or from the rest of nature. But then there is what is called the emergence question, which is, again, closer to the substantive question. How do subjects appear or come into being in or as part of nature, if they do so at all? So first, there's a question of how we define the subject in nature in distinction to things that are not subjects. But then there is the emergence question, which is a genealogical, if you will, and causal story about how it is that subjects emerge in the course of natural history, right? Insofar as one might want to say, if one wants to say this, again, this is problematic by itself, I understand, but if one wants to say that subjects emerge in nature, right, then one has to have a story about how it is, at what point and how it is that subjects came into the picture from a subjective nature. Well, that is what is called the emergence question in this classical way. So naturalists' answers to the emergence question, they say precisely, and this is what, you know, large degree naturalism means when we're thinking of naturalist conceptions of the subject, that the subject is part of nature, and that one can, in fact, causally explain the emergence of subjectivity in nature through an account of evolutionary biology, through an account of, for example, at the limit, there's even those who think that there's a suitably general physical explanation that explains the emergence of nature from basic, microphysical, processes occurring even at the sub-biological level. But there's many ways you can cut it. The naturalist solution would say, yes, there is a causal story to be set. Subjects emerge in nature. They are not always there. In fact, subjects come into the picture rather late. And without having to say very much right now about how we define subjects, I mean, here, what we're basically trying to say is that whether we define it as life or as cognition or as, genius, this is a fairly rare development, but it takes place in natural history. So there is a naturalist story, that is to say, a story that can be set through the perspective of the natural sciences that will tell us how subjects emerge from nature. Now, this is where things start getting a little bit finicky, however, and we begin to understand that, okay, the emergence question, however, is laden with a series of assumptions, perhaps, that we might want to probe further and not just simply take for granted. Because those of us who are familiar with, for example, idealist philosophy or panpsychist philosophy, pantheist philosophy, halozoist philosophies, they claim that nature is, as a whole, subjective, or even more radically identical to nature. That subjectivity and nature are coeval in some sort, or that they are, in any case, equiprimordial, that when nature comes into being is equivalent to thinking or subjectivity coming into being. However you define subjectivity, there's different ways to do this, right? From Spinoza to Schelling, actually, to Schopenhauer. So there is a kind of equiprimordiality between nature and that's a Heideggerian locution again, between nature and subjectivity. But then there's also the flip side to this, which is there are those who think, of course, that subjectivity somehow precedes nature. For example, theistic approaches, right, obviously claim that the world, the natural world, as we understand it, was created by God, right? And however you define God, or you're creating agency, it's clearly possible. It's clearly a hypothesis that that nature does not come first, right? And in fact, this goes back to this question of whether nature is the only domain of being that there is, or a domain of being even, or whether there is non-natural being. So in a typical quote unquote religious dualist sense, we could say that, yeah, sure, God pre-exists nature. God is not a natural being, i.e. it's not one more entity in the natural world among others. So it exists, strictly speaking, insofar as God is a subject, or the subject paradigmatically, right? Endowed with intellectual intuition, whose thinking brings the world into being, we have to say that subjectivity, in fact, precedes nature. So in this case, the emergence question becomes flipped around, right? How is it that nature emerges from the subject, right? And here is going to depend on your theistic or creationist story. So with this in mind, understanding that this can go both ways, or even you can say that both terms are equiprimordial, that the emergence of thinking subjectivity is coeval, we can formulate what I call a second emergence question, which is more primitive than the emergence question as it is formulated traditionally. And this is the question: does the subject emerge from asubjective nature as part of it, or does nature emerge from the subject, right? That is, I think, what I call the second emergence question. And that's a fundamental question, of course, that we can ask ourselves. Next distinction, and I'll take a short stopgap here after this one, just to decant and have any questions or any comments, right? Just so I don't overload the class with conceptual distinctions. But the next distinction is a very familiar distinction and a very important distinction that animates the history of philosophy since its origins, even though it's only explicitly formulated in in a theoretical manner, rather quite late in the medieval period. And today it means something quite specific, and we'll have a lot to read about this. But it's a distinction between Platonism and naturalism. Now, roughly speaking, this is only as a mode of introduction. We're going to get much more precise about this distinction, which is very difficult. But in any case, let's just simply go with this as it were. Platonism is the thesis according to which being qua being, the domain of being, is formal or ideal as it is disclosed to thinking through mathematical or dialectical cognition, and is separated from what is disclosed to the senses. Okay, let's just take it at that. So nature can be identified under this conception with the idealities captured by pure cognition. Mathematical entities, forms, ideas. In contemporary jargon, for example, we call Badiou a Platonist because he thinks that ontology is set theory, that set theory describes the forms of being qua being. I know that he has sort of nuance his view, but this is just a paradigmatic example. Or for those of you who are more familiar with the analytic tradition, a paradigmatic example of this would be Quine's Pythagoreanism, which also claims that mathematical entities and paradigmatically against sets are real, that they are items in the world. Well, the idea that the fundamental constituents of the universe are mathematical entities, what is sometimes called abstract entities in technical shop talk, that is characteristically what is called Platonism. And for Platonism, classically, the idea is that these mathematical or abstract entities are real, whereas the domain that we see or experience through the senses, the empirical world that we see, the world of quote unquote appearances, is epiphenomenal, not real, or, you know, in any case, secondary. That the truth lies in these idealities that we capture not through the senses, but through pure cognition. This is what is classically conceived of as Platonism, as far as, you know, we can say. And according to a Platonist conception of the subject, the power of subjectivity, or what defines subjectivity, is going to become coeval with a power of thinking. The power of thinking precisely to gain access to this domain of intelligibility that lies beyond the sensible. So of course, in the case of Plato, it is the capacity to, if you know the journey through the divided line, to wrest yourself from the copies and simulacra that populate the world of appearance, and to grasp those hypothetical and, at the highest level, dialectical idealities that are, properly speaking, only for Plato, conceived through a kind of mathematical understanding. Okay. And, you know, again, I could give you a contemporary example. The case of Badiou is always very clean, but thinking is precisely a subtractive enterprise, he calls it, because it is about how it is that we separate ourselves from the flux of bodies and languages that are always changing and contingent, and we access the invariant forms of being that compose, you know, the domain of what he calls pure multiplicity, and this is set theoretically understood. Never mind, that's all for us later, but it's just, hopefully that's somewhat clear. Naturalism, which is the flip side, is the thesis that being qua being is equivalent to the domain of appearing in the sense of what is disclosed to the senses. And therefore that thinking, that nature is subject to empirical investigation, not just a purely mathematical or cognitive ascent beyond the senses, but that in fact nature, being, is what is tractable through empirical research, paradigmatically through what we call today the natural sciences, right? So this is a more restricted definition, the natural sciences as we understand them today. So the subject in naturalist approaches would be conceived as belonging to nature. And therefore, in naturalist approaches, there is a possible empirical access to the being of the subject, that we investigate subjectivity as one more empirical being among other beings. This is a classical conception that, you know, says that, in fact, there is no separation between the subject in the sense that it captures transcendental forms or something like that, and the domain of empirical study, through which we understand rocks and cats. You know, to understand the subject is to engage in a kind of empirical investigation. And, you know, what does this mean? Well, obviously, for example, that to understand the subject, really, we need to do nothing else than to attend to, for example, the findings of cognitive science, neurobiology, evolutionary biology, perhaps psychology in its various strands, and so on and so forth. But it is an empirical matter, right? But like our previous distinction, this distinction becomes extremely finicky, very, very, very finicky very soon. And we can see not very difficult, without much difficulty why. Because for Plato, sure, the domain of the intelligible, which is the domain of being qua being, the domain of the forms or ideas, however you translate it, is accessed by pure mathematics, but it is these principles of pure mathematics that organize the invariant forms of being that we only capture in its transient expression in the sensible world. So geometry, the principles of geometry, provide us knowledge, if you want to call it like a more modern shop talk, a priori knowledge about the forms of space. But this knowledge, which is mathematical, is not just simply transcendent from the domain of the sensible in some weirdly dualistic fashion or a disconnected fashion. In fact, Plato, as probably most of you know, has a complex doctrine of participation, which is a kind of, it's a translation, but it's like the idea is that these invariant forms of being that are described through the mathematical sciences, or mathematics, if you call it a science even, are in fact the forms in which every sensible body participates. So it is not that these are somehow separated from the sensible world in a way that is completely unintelligible in relationship to the sensible world. The sensible world incarnates or participates in these invariant shapes. And if you know, those of you who read the Republic, we will be reading part of this for the second session. Plato has a famous, when he is detailing his theory of the divided line, and through the allegory of the cave, it's describing how it is that the subject emerges as a kind of power of thinking that ascends from the domain of the sensible to the intelligible. And he foresees at the highest, at the end of the line, the most glorious and purified idea that the human could ever capture, the subject could ever capture, the idea of the good, the ordering principle of the universe. This is also, of course, something that would be intelligible through a kind of mathematical cognition, but for this maturity, for this like understanding of the regulative principle of the universe, we need something more than geometry as it existed in Plato's time. He actually tells us that what we would need is a science of motion, which we didn't have at the time, right? Which he didn't have at the time. He foresees a science of motion, a mathematical science of motion that would basically be coeval with something like what we get with modern physics, right? With Newtonian mechanics, precisely. So this is why also I think it's important to understand, well, okay, so what happens in the modern period when nature itself becomes understood in mathematical terms? All of a sudden, when nature becomes itself mathematically or formally conceived, then the distinction between the empirical and the quote unquote mathematical or formal sort of collapses into each other, because it is mathematics that formalizes, that expresses the being of the empirical domain that we see and feel, right? Mathematical modern physics is precisely the thorough quote unquote mathematization of nature, i.e. the formalization of the empirical. So what happens at this point? How do we negotiate, or do we negotiate at all? Is there still this distinction between the domain of the senses and the domain of, the forms, or whatever you want to call it? How do we negotiate between Platonism and naturalism, right? Just to say something that contemporary naturalisms can also be Platonist in spirit, insofar as they claim that nature as such, as explored by the natural sciences, is mathematically conceived. For example, those of you who know a little bit about contemporary philosophy of science, and we'll talk more about this, there is a position called structural realism, ontic structural realism, among others, that claims that the concept of structure articulates our understanding of nature, that nature is mathematically constructed, and that structure is, in fact, real patterns as understood, in basically information theoretic terms, but we don't have to worry too much about that right now. But okay, this creates further methodological problems, right, obviously. Let me stop there for one brief second, just to decant and make sure that we're all sort of following the series of distinctions here. I'm going rather quickly, but any questions, any thoughts, any comments?
I have a question.
Sure.
Well, this might be too broad, but I wonder why you are choosing the concept of subject and not object, for example. Because, for example, the first distinction you made between nature 1 and nature 2 could be used when in the case of object 2. I mean, we can attribute nature to objects also, and we could say that we could speak of nature as the individuating element of objects, and nature as substance.
Right.
So most of the things you said for subjects could be said for objects. So I wonder why, what difference subject make in this picture? Why not objects? Yeah, that's
Sure.
the main.
Well, that's interesting. Well, I mean, this is actually one of the distinctions that I will talk about after, like shortly after. This is another the relationship between subject and object. As you know, probably as like there's a again narrow way in which we understand this relationship as and there is a sort of broader sense, because the concept of subject as such, of course, is formulated in the modern period, actually, well, in the scholastic period, but the concept of object is taken to be correlative to the concept of subject, right? Heidegger has a very long exposition about this, and I will actually talk about this in a little bit. There's a quote that I want to share that draws this relationship. But what you're saying is exactly right. I mean, you could understand the same problem, or quote unquote, reiterate the same question that we said vis-a-vis nature one, nature two in relation to the subject with regards to the object, in the sense of, well, it's going to depend on how you define objectivity, right? And how you define objects as such. Are objects what? Substances in the classical metaphysical Aristotelian sense, or are objects somehow in the, let's call it, more liberal sense of the term as we understand it today, something like with object-oriented ontology, right? Where an object is not exactly speaking an Aristotelian essence, but it is something that does have an essence, but that obeys a different kind of ontology, right? Just kind of like proto-intentionality folded back into nature or something like that. I mean, the concept of object then is also subject to these possible variations. And on the basis of that, you can say, as for example, someone like Graham Harman would say, that the subject is actually a kind of object, right? That's exactly right. Or even in the Aristotelian tradition, what we would say is that the subject is a substance, right? And now he wouldn't call substance an object in the strict sense. I mean, that would require some translation work right there. But you're exactly right. I mean, we're back in the same water. So that's going to depend largely on your ontology, right? And your metaphysics. So if you have an object ontology and an object metaphysics, how it is that this object ontology and metaphysics relates to the constitution of the natural world, i.e. nature is a domain of objects among others, and how it is that subjects fit into an object world is also part of it. Because the idealist, quote unquote, tradition, of which paradigmatically we see with Kant, will say that the category of object is, strictly speaking, a representational category that is always the correlate of a subject. You don't have objects in the sense of mind-independent substances that fly free of subjects, right? But of course, in a classical, quote unquote, realist Aristotelian essentialist ontology, objects, insofar as we can, for the moment, equate them with substances, are mind-independent entities. And certainly today, when we speak of object-oriented ontologies, they are presumably subject-independent entities, right? Objects without subjects. And indeed, even someone like Badiou, for example, for those of us who are familiar with his phenomenology, right? Part of what he's trying to define there in his theory of the object and the transcendental logic is precisely a theory of the object without a subject, right? The object does not require a subject. In fact, again, the subject is a rare thing. But it is not the object conceived in a naturalist spirit any more than it is for Harman's side, right? So again, you're absolutely right. This is another concept that creates ripples in the water of our question, and we will be addressing it as well. Is that helpful?
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you.
No, thanks to you. Yeah, any more?
Yep. It's Daryl.
Yes.
Do you think there's something inherent in, I'm not sure how I'm going to say this, but let's just be crass and say in the concept of subject that has allowed this wide range of fluidity of interpretations? Or are you saying that the whole concept of the seminar is that nature is that thing that is a leverage off of which ideas of subject evolve?
So that's difficult, because I think The answer to the latter question is yes, sometimes. So part of the idea is, there are, the way these two concepts are articulated. So there's two questions, right? Why has the subject been subject to such flexibility? Well, both concepts have been subject to a great degree of flexibility. In the case of the subject, the flexibility, I think, has to do with partially normative issues, not in the Brandomian sense, but in the sense of attempts to negotiate or to, in an ancient theistic context, an attempt to try to like salvage in a kind of quote unquote anthropocentric manner the uniqueness of the human as somehow separated from just the bare order of the rest of the world. And one of the things that, of course, comes under considerable stress with the quote unquote modern secularization of nature and so on is the idea that you can, in fact, pull the human apart. This is why, with the concept of the subject, you oftentimes have, for example, with Kant, right, paradigmatically, a distinction between the empirical self and the transcendental subject, right? Just like in the theistic context, in the sort of quote unquote theological context, you might distinguish between the human body or the incarnate side of the human and the soul, which remains somehow transcendent or irreducible. Well, one of the things that I'm trying to trace and understand is how it is that the stress that is put into this quote unquote exceptionalism, which motivates the separation from in our conceptions of subjectivity from our concepts of nature, leads eventually to, however, also opposite strategies. In other words, not just to say, well, okay, shit, we were being pious and religious, blah, 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 so we collapse the two orders. But actually, also what happens is we realize that an attempt to fully integrate the subject into nature creates problems of its own that seem to be equally, quote unquote, pious or religious in their own way. That, in other words, we have a problem when we try to just simply conflate the subject into nature, but by the same token, to keep them apart creates another set of problems. So that's one of the things that we will have a chance to like look at exactly how this happens, the two sets of problems that we face, right? And a provisional set of these questions, it was anticipated earlier on when we were reading the syllabus description, and there was mention of McDowell's distinction between bald naturalism and rampant Platonism. And these are two polarities, if you want, in the spectrum of naturalization or conflation between the subject and and nature, and on the other hand, a thorough separation. And in that distinction, you see crystallized the sets of problems that emerge when you either try to separate the two to the point of unintelligibility, or when you try to conflate the two to the point of indistinction. So that's one of the things that I'm interested in, which is how it is that at the extremes, we seem to fold back into a kind of religiosity or a kind of like precarity in our explanatory accounts. How it is that even though it might seem intuitively, I suppose, that Platonism is on the side of like supernaturalism, religiosity, dogmatism, if you will, something like that. The empiricist is always the one who has the kind of penchant on clarity of mind. It's actually not as simple as that. So that's part of what motivates this kind of like articulation, right? Your second question was, I didn't quite understand. Can you repeat it maybe? Or the second part of your question?
Well, I guess the second part just led into, I think you've been answering it, but then was nature, is it's wrestling with nature and the problem of nature? Is that what you're proposing is driving these revisions of the idea of the subject?
Oh, I see. I think it's not just yes, but also it goes the other way around, right? Because we're going to see with someone like Badiou, for example, with someone like Deleuze, for example, you have something quite interesting, which is not only that our changes in our conceptions of nature change our conceptions of the subject, our conceptions of the subject give way to a new conceptions of nature. Or in the case of McDowell, for example, right, which is something that he sees as indebted to Aristotle, again, and also with Sellers, right, that recognition of these capacities that are distinctive to the human enjoin us to produce a kind of new metaphysics that expands and revises our concepts of nature. So it's not only that we change our concepts of the subject on the basis of an ever-changing concept of nature, which evolves in the course of scientific, say, studies. It also goes the other way around. Philosophers have said that we need to reconceive nature on the basis of our increasing quote-unquote understanding of what it means to be a subject. So it's a two-way street, depending on the point in history and where you stand.
Thank you. So, sorry, I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
One is very brief, but so my big question is, I think, methodological, and I wonder about the. It's going to sound a bit crass, but so be it. I wonder about the utility of tracing to terms like this in the way that we're doing, because in a sense, to me, it strikes me that since to take just one of these two terms, the subject has been conceived in so massively different terms in different times and in different and put to so different kinds of uses, so that it's almost as if we sort of try to the different basically conceptions of the subject try to respond to different problems, so that in putting kind of the subject nature and the nature of the subject distinction as a kind of pivot, we risk actually answering different problems and we end up with having different kinds of responses to questions that aren't that similar, or are they? And I wonder sort of
right.
to what extent can we sort of make sure that the problems that we are tracing is actually a kind of not something that we just
staple together arbitrarily.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, actually, the very first, if you remember, the very first point that we began with was precisely this kind of separation between, first of all, the sense in which nature is being used in these two senses, right? Nature as an attributive and nature as a substantive sense. And this led us into the subsidiary question, which is what definitional criteria do we use to define our concepts of subjectivity and nature? And one of the questions that we were trying to ask is, well, it appears, like you're saying, that there is a kind of, if not arbitrarity, at the very least, such wide variability of, criteria that are brought to bear in order to define both of these concepts, that the set of problems that they're meant to answer, the kinds of theoretical paradigms in which they're embedded, are so widely divergent that you might think, well, okay, sure, syntactically it might seem like we're talking about the same thing because the term appears here and there, but are we really talking about a common set of problems, right? Or are we just like sort of taking this massive chew of a pie that semantically sort of has some resonances here and there, but it doesn't? So one of the things I want to suggest is that part of, that problem precisely, the fact that we do not have a clear set of definitional criteria is what leads also to an appearance of a substantive enormous gap between our philosophical conceptions when we're actually, in fact, answering different questions. And that's part of the task. There's always this kind of platitudinous response, which is to say, we're just talking about semantic issues, right? That's a typical say that we say in the vernacular, right? But of course, we understand, those of us who are in the business of philosophy, that semantic issues are not just semantic issues precisely, because they are, those define the parameters of the problems and questions and terms that we want to use to solve, how we understand phenomena themselves. The semantics guides our ontology, right? You don't have a at least clear notion of an ontology without having a precise definition of what you're trying to talk about. So one of the things that I am trying to sort of pick apart is how it is that oftentimes when there is this kind of like, the subject is this, no, the subject is that, nature is this, no, no, nature is that. How much of that is simply, using completely different definitions, which are motivated by unstated different criteria? So what I'm trying to also do is to see, this school defines nature as thus, and the subject as thus, because they are trying to define this and this, because that's the problem that they're trying to solve. This tradition is trying to solve these sets of problems. Maybe they overlap substantially, maybe they diverge substantially, but it is in looking at this divergence and convergence that you can start to gain a kind of bridge of intelligibility. Let me give you an example, okay, just to make it more concrete, to make sure that we, I've been recently having a very, very heated set of discussions with some people that claim that defining the subject in terms of deliberative cognition in a quote unquote Kantian manner, right, is unduly anthropocentric. It leads to catastrophic political, ethical conclusions that denies agency to the natural world, and so on and so forth. And part of the thing that, you know, we would want to say is, okay, is this because we want to say that it is important that when we use the term subjectivity or agency or thinking or whatever, we need to include, we need to have a broader definition because there are these subsidiary criteria, ethical, pragmatic, blah, 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 right? And we have this imperative, which is anthropocentrism bad, something like that, right? This is not something that, so that's a set of unstated criteria, but these criteria are most times not made explicit whatsoever. And it's only when you start making them explicit that you start saying, oh, okay, well, we need to have a debate about these first before we can answer the question, right? So in the case that I was mentioning to you, right, like the sort of like claim that a Kantian style definition of subjectivity in terms of rationality, deliberative cognition, agency, thus and so, is restrictive. I would say, well, let's look at what else he defines as part of the subject, right? There's sensibility, there's the imagination. What's left missing? And why is it that if there are all these other things that surely Kant does not call thinking proper, but they are part of experience, is it that we just simply want to include some of these other things under the term thinking? Or is it that we still haven't defined enough the different kinds of mediation that are part of experience? Because those are different problems that you might want to have, right? So yes, there's going to be a substantial sort of breadth of the problems we're gonna be addressing, but there's also gonna be these points of contact and overlap, which are going to reveal to us deeper methodological motivations. And I think in diagnosing those, you understand things that are normally not understood. So for example, the debates between left and right Salarsians or between naturalist and Platonist approaches are often motivated by a series of understated methodological criteria definitional assumptions, which once made explicit, make the possibility of coordination much more easy. And this is something that became obvious to me when well, not obvious, but laboriously evident as I was working through the attempt to precisely bring together insights from naturalist and Platonist approaches, right? Or transcendentalist approaches. So we will see how these things come together and also diverge.
Thank you. I think that's a very exciting answer, and I think I'm very happy about sort of making that explicit and about just taking the possibility that we are dealing with different problems very seriously and then working with that to get down to some kind of what shared problems might be found underneath it all. So thanks for that.
Yes, and this is why I wanted to begin by like not trying to play any tricks, like the nature of and nature. These are this is being used in two different senses, right? But then of course this leads to the common question, which is, are natures, nature one in the attributive sense, part of nature? In other words, are natures natural kinds themselves? So that's a question that we might want to ask, because that's part of the question. Do intentions, meanings, things like that, do they belong to nature, as someone like McDowell would want to say, so that we have to amplify nature and create this thing called second nature? Or in fact, are these things just heuristic devices? This is the first problem that we emerge, right? The ontological, epistemological senses in which we speak of nature one, nature as attributive. So you see, it gets really convoluted really quick, but it's going to become progressively elaborated as we move forward. Any more questions?
Daniel, just a very quick yes or no question.
Sure.
I just had a doubt about if you're identifying Plato as a transcendental philosopher, not grounded, obviously, in the subject, but still a transcendental philosopher.
Yes, I was using the term loosely there. So I wouldn't call him a transcendental philosopher in the sense in which we say transcendental philosophy constitutes itself since Kant, right? It is transcendental in the simple and sort of crass sense in which the forms are transcendental vis-a-vis sensible bodies. And they can be considered to be transcendental insofar as you can define the forms not as transcendent archetypes in a kind of two-world dualist reading of Plato, which I think is a bad reading of Plato, but insofar as these forms or formal conditions specify invariant conditions for the individuation of spatial bodies. So geometrical principles describe the forms of space, the invariant forms of space, right? So in a certain way, it is a kind of a priori investigation into the conditions of the constitution of space, which is exactly what Kant thought, incidentally, right? Kant, in this regard, can be considered to be a full-blown Platonist. For Kant, the form of outer sense, what he calls the form of outer sense, which is space, is a form of intuition. It is a form of representation, but the study of geometry, right, is precisely laying out the conditions of possibility of our experience of the external world, extended objects in space. So it's not exactly dissimilar, right? So that I was using it in that term, even though, of course, Plato is not conceiving this as part of a transcendental theory of experience or anything of the sort. But...
Yeah, thanks. No, I agree. Yeah, the question was, I was just thinking about this, the theory of participation as a transcendental theory in a sense, but not grounded in the subject. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, actually, you can think of this. Transcendental originally means pertaining to an investigation of the invariant conditions and possibility of experience, right? But of course, as we move forward out of the Kantian idealist embeddedness, one of the things that we know is, again, to use the example of Badiou, he has a transcendental phenomenology or logic, right? But it's asubjective. It has to do with the individuation of beings in the world, right? So you can dislodge the transcendental from a theory of experience proper, right? Even phenomenology, which is even more radically, right? I mean, it is a phenomenology, self-admittedly, but it's a phenomenology without the subject. So again, it's one of these things where the term becomes dislodged from its place of origin, as it were.
Daniel, can I just, like, before you continue, I just would like to give you a heads up to try to leave like half an hour at the end probably for us to distribute the presentations, because since we have a lot of people, I'm afraid that might actually take
it might take a little bit. Yeah, you're right. Yes,
yeah.
I do have some more material to cover, but I think we have one more question by Will H in the chat room. He's in the audit room, but yes, you may ask the question. And in the meantime, if anybody else wants to say anything or ask a question, go ahead.
Yeah, like maybe he can like write it down there, and then I'll read it to you the next question
the next break. Okay, so let me just get back to the exposition then, and then because I mean there's quite a bit to go, but I'll try to be a little bit more.
Like we are supposed to finish in like 45 minutes from now.
Yeah. I'm looking at the clock I have next to me, so I'll leave about 15 for the presentation coordination, and then that should be enough. I'll be dictatorial about that.
Okay.
Okay. So the next thing, let me make sure that I'm okay. Great. The other another distinction, this one obviously dovetails into much of the stuff that we just spoke, is the distinction between transcendental versus empirical conceptions of the subject. So roughly speaking, for those of us who are not familiar with this distinction, transcendental is the notion that the concept of the subject is not a natural kind, but must be understood in a non-empirical register. For example, a register of transcendental psychology, existential phenomenology. And this is the distinction I was mentioning to you, which is canonically made by Kant between the empirical self and the transcendental subject. So again, it resonates with Platonism, right? In this regard, just like Regis was probing, insofar as we define the subject in exception to just one more entity in the natural order that can be empirically accessed to. There's a distinction. We are double in our being. We have this empirical being, but also a kind of irreducible dimension, which is precisely what the investigation into the synthetic a priori conditions of possibility of experience is supposed to make explicit for Kant, or what the existential conditions for disclosure of beings is for Heidegger, and so on and so forth. Empirical conceptions of the subject will say that the subject is subject to empirical investigation in the same way as the rest of natural being. So obviously this dovetails or coincides in its spirit with what we called naturalist approaches in distinction to Platonist approaches. But in fact, in the 20th century, empiricism and naturalism in the analytic philosophical tradition were considered to be in tension with each other. And we'll talk more about that. We don't have to worry too much about that right now. So there's an important distinction between empiricism and naturalism. They do not always converge, just like Platonism and naturalism are not always in conflict, but can converge. Okay. So one more time, we have this question. So here I just give a little bit of a historical background, which actually goes to Regis's question and comment, which is that transcendental conceptions have their roots in Platonism, but of course they find their locus classicus, their explicit elaboration, as part of Kant's critical philosophy and the theory of the faculties. And in the 19th and 20th centuries, after Kant, we see this exploration of the transcendental conditions of subjectivation or transcendental subjectivity be radicalized past Kant's account of the quote-unquote representational or cognitive forms of experience that define the subject for him as a knower in various registers. So phenomenology examines the existential and practical modes of disclosure, Heidegger, the ready to hand, the tools, blah, blah, blah. Historicism examines historical forms of disclosure that are mediated by, epochal times of being, Heidegger himself, but also Gadamer and people like that. Existentialism also, of course, explores different forms of existential disclosure to the subject, which include unconscious mechanisms, deconstruction, non-philosophy. You can consider all of these as sort of iterations or radicalizations of transcendental investigations into the conditions of subjectivation. Empirical conceptions of the subject are said to have their roots philosophically proximally in so-called Aristotelian naturalist conceptions, but in modern saga can be considered to be coeval with Spinoza's and Schellingian alternatives as well, which is, of course, kind of weird because Spinoza is, of course, a paradigmatic rationalist philosopher. But one of the things that we get there is that the subject and nature are one and the same, and God and nature are one and the same, and therefore that there is this kind of like ubiquity of the subject into nature, and that nature, as explored by science, is in fact, of course, for him it means the geometrical method is again a mathematical or quasi-Platonist route, but it is empirical in the sense that it is subject to direct empirical investigation. I think this is not exactly correct, but this is the way it's actually formulated in most textbooks. Anyway, and I'm not going to get into the other part just because it's more exegetical background. You can look at that into your own time. But here we get to actually Evrim's question, which is the subject-object distinction and the distinction between physis and being. It's another conceptual distinction that's interesting because there is a tradition, in particular the phenomenological tradition that follows from Heidegger, according to which the subject is itself a kind of bad category, that the subject is not something that we have to explain even, or something that deserves explaining, because it is one of these metaphysically loaded notions that once we actually deconstruct, as it were, right, evinces itself as already presupposing a series of assumptions concerning being that are completely laden and loaded. And in the case of the subject, Heidegger traces its elaboration specifically in the modern period to the Kantian conception, well, to the Cartesian and Kantian conception, of philosophy, in which subjectivity is interrelatable or intertwined with the concept of the object. Subject and object are part of this kind of dyad that articulates the theory of experience and the theory of the cogito, but that once they are evinced for what they are actually a way to distort both the nature of, well, not the subject anymore, but the nature of human being or our being in the world, what he calls Dasein, as much as the nature of being, because being is not an object or even a domain of objects. And this leads Heidegger not only to deconstruct the concept of the subject in favor of a concept he calls Dasein, as probably most of you already know, but he also is led to deconstruct the concept of nature as understood as a domain of beings, because he thinks that the concept of nature as it is understood originally by the Greeks before this quote unquote reification of substance that takes place through Aristotle paradigmatically, although it's already there in Plato, to think of nature as what I mentioned earlier, the disclosure, the horizontal disclosure of beings. And so here's a quote, actually two quotes of Heidegger that are helpful to understand this kind of like difference. Is the one quote that I chose for this class because I think it's actually kind of interesting retrospectively. Quote, if we apply this to the Kantian formulation of the subject concept, it will signify that the ego is a subjectum having knowledge about its predicates, which are representations, cogitations, in the widest sense, and which as such are intentionally directed towards something. This implies that in the cognitive possession of its predicates as intentional comportments, the ego also already comports itself to the beings toward which the comportments are directed. This is, of course, a definition of what is called intentionality, the fact that the mind or the subject's actions are always about something, directed towards something. This relationship of aboutness is what's called intentionality. Since such beings toward which comportments are, and comportments are intentional attitudes, basically. Since such beings toward which comportments are directed are always designated in certain ways as objects, it can be said formally that the subject always belongs, that to the subject always belongs an object. One cannot be thought without the other. It seems at first sight as if in beginning with the subject-object relation, a more appropriate point of departure for inquiry has been gained and a less biased way of taking the problem than the one-sided start from the subject. Scrutinized more closely, this beginning with a subject-object relation obstructs access to the real ontological question regarding the mode of being of the subject, as well as the mode of being of the entity that may possibly, but does not necessarily have to become an object. So this for Heidegger will lead again to deconstruct the concept of subject and the concept of nature as understood as a domain of being or as a domain of investigation for the natural sciences or for even the empirical sciences more broadly, to sort of retrieve a more originary concept of subjectivity. And by the way, this quote is from the Basic Problems of Phenomenology, the Hofstadter translation, page 157. I just remembered. And here is the other quote, the one about nature, which gives you the flip side. In the age, and this is from Introduction to Metaphysics, in the age of the first and definitive unfolding of Western philosophy among the Greeks, when questioning about beings as such and as a whole received its true inception, beings were called physis. This fundamental Greek word for being is usually translated as nature. We use the Latin translation natura, which means to be born, birth. But with this Latin translation, the originary content of the Greek word physis is already thrust aside. The authentic philosophical naming force of the Greek word is destroyed. Physis as emergence can be experienced everywhere. For example, in celestial processes, the rising of the sun, in the surging of the sea, in the growth of plants, in the coming forth of animals and human beings from the womb. But physis, the emerging sway, is not synonymous with these processes, which we still today count as part of nature. This emerging and standing out of itself from itself may not be taken as just one process among others that we observe in beings. Physis is being itself, by virtue of which beings first become and remain observable. So here's an idea, again, this is the idea that nature itself has to be, quote unquote, given a non-ontic interpretation, not understood as a domain of beings or even as the domain of being as a whole, but that it has to do with the ontological mode of disclosure on whose basis any domain of being whatsoever is made intelligible to not the subject, but Dasein. A couple more distinctions and then we can call it shop. I mean, I have a lot more, but it will have to do for today. Another distinction that we will obviously be revisiting or visiting is the distinction between the manifest and the scientific images of man in the world. This is a distinction put forward by the philosopher Wilfrid Sellars. And roughly speaking, the manifest image is what we call the framework of persons, in which the subject is understood as an intentional being that has intentional attitudes, and carries or instantiates normative statuses. That is to say, a being who believes, who knows, who indicts, who justifies, who desires. And these intentional attitudes are, of course, propositional attitudes as well, in the sense that, to believe is to believe that P, where P is a stand-in for a proposition or a sentence, such as, I believe that there is a cat on the mat. The cat on the mat is a sentence that can be true or false. And my attitude
I believe that the cat is on the mat, is something that is constitutively propositional in character. The attitude is modeled on a discursive state, something that can be true or false, on a sentential state, right? On a propositional state. That's why it's called propositional attitudes. So this is the stance that is also called the normative stance, or Daniel Dennett, among others, call it the intentional stance, the manifest image, the way we understand ourselves as people, persons, as agents with intentions and feelings and desires and beliefs and blah, 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 right? It's also roughly coeval with what is called the space of reasons, right? Where we justify and talk to each other by saying, I believe that so-and-so, but you're wrong because, anyway. Second, we have the scientific image, which is the understanding of the subject as a complex physical system. But here, it's not only that the subject is understood as part of nature, that mankind is understood as part of nature, but it is, in a certain sense, eliminated in it. The subject, as described in the manifest image, is pulverized. It's considered epiphenomenal. And Sellers, in fact, tells us that within the scientific image, in this sense, to the extent that the manifest image does not survive within it, to the extent that there is no place in nature for intentions and norms and so on, man does not survive. Now, for him, for Sellers, this is not going to mean that man does not survive. What this means is precisely what we were interrogating before, that Carl was also interrogating before, which is, well, how do we, well then, you know, where do we go from there then? What Sellers is going to propose is, no, actually, we need to reconceive of our concept of nature in order to make room for these kinds of things. But this path, the way that we transform our concept of nature so as to accommodate subjectivity within it, can go in more than one direction. We can either include intentions, norms, and so on as natural kinds, just bluntly introducing and saying intentions, beliefs, attitudes, thoughts, desires are basic constituents of nature, like subatomic particles and fields and so on are. Or you can say that you can translate the vocabulary of intentions into a causal naturalistic register that is suitably expanded beyond the mechanistic framework of causation. And that distinction is actually the real distinction between quote unquote left and right solarsins. It's not what is usually taken to be. That's the more like deep distinction. Now there's another subsidiary distinction. The distinction between the manifest and scientific images really concerns more deeply a relationship between observables and unobservables. In the manifest image, you explain observable behavior, i.e. the way we behave in the world, by virtue of postulating internal states, i.e. thoughts and sensations, that are observable, but only introspectively. So you can observe your internal states, but of course they're not publicly observable. So there's a distinction between two kinds of observable, introspectable observables and extrospectable observables. And the manifest image postulates introspectable observables as the causes that explain extrospectable observables. So you say something like, he raised his hand because he had the thought that I need to ask a question, right? Where the thought is the causal antecedent for the action. So it's a causal explanation. The manifest image, the scientific image in turn postulates unobservables as the causes for both introspectable and extrospectable observables. So you postulate something like, he had the thought that he wanted to raise a question because of this particular process going on in his neurobiological machinery or so on and so forth. That's an unobservable that requires the postulation of entities that are, strictly speaking, only theoretically inferentially known. They're not observable in the same sense as our own thoughts and external objects are in the middle-sized objects in the third person regularly are taken to be. It's more complicated than that, but that'll do for now. And maybe one more, the distinction between first nature and second nature. This is another distinction that follows downstream from Sellers. First nature is nature understood by the natural sciences as part of a mechanistic framework of laws and causal principles, which is perfectly good to explain the behavior of beings before the emergence of thinking in the world, before the emergence of subjects as understood in this quote unquote Kantian way as thinking beings. But actually, more robustly, life. So I shouldn't say just thought there, but life and thought. Anyway, second nature is nature as including non-mechanistic, normative, and intentional behavior of cognitive beings in the space of reasons. This is classically McDowell's appropriation of the Aristotelian concept of second nature, which, for those of you who don't know, Aristotle, and we're going to be reading this, includes as part of nature intentions, telos. So he has a natural teleology that nature is in fact incarnated purposes. And in fact, the formal being of a being, that which defines its nature one, what it is also what defines its telos. In other words, that which it ought to be. And nature has a kind of inbred normativity into itself. Norms are natural kinds for Aristotle. And McDowell, famously in Mind and World, following from Sellers, says Sellers was right. We need to amplify our concept of nature. And the way to do this is precisely to plug into nature these things called normative attitudes as second nature. Sellers' solution is different, as I mentioned before. Sellers' own solution is to amplify the concept of nature by a new kind of process ontology that transforms our concepts of intentionality and normativity into a process of metaphysics. But we don't have to worry about that either, right? So this is the only thing that I signal here is that this can go more than one way. So I had a very like sort of long, well, not very long, but more robust explanation of the historical tracing of these distinctions. So I just gave you the conceptual distinctions in a kind of synchronic manner and try to illustrate it scatteredly through some examples. But I will only say a couple of things, just like glossing over this for 5 minutes, and then we can stop here, have a few final round of questions and comments, and then we can do the presentations, okay? Schedule the presentations. So the first thing I want to say is that the conceptualization of the subject in the sense of an integral being that includes a series of modalities or that is defined by a particular modality, whether it be reason or deliberative cognition or genius or whatever you want, or revolutionary activity, whatever you want, and encompassing a variety of possible faculties or domains. It can be dated proximately in our philosophical history to Plato's account of the divided soul from the fourth book of Republic, for Republic 4. And as you might know, this account already divides the soul into a series of parts, right? In Republic 4, Plato famously distinguishes between the rational, the appetitive, and the spirited parts of the soul, so that we are in fact these complex beings that have these different, let's call it parts. Notice that this is a predecessor account to what in the modern period would be the account of the faculties. The fact that we as subjects are constituted by, for example, sensibility, the imagination, and the understanding, right? And reason after that. In other words, it's a way to sort of compartmentalize the different functions that define us as integral subjects, right? The soul is one, but it has different parts. Just as like in the modern subject, the subject is one, but it has different faculties. So there's a direct analogy here that we need to keep in mind, right? Let me take a quick look at the chat because there's like 50 messages in there.
Yeah, I think we decided or suggested that we could sort of schedule the presentations offline or after a class, so that you can have more time to go through this if everyone's okay with it.
Last time this was a mess, and I
I asked Ezra if we could do it online, and he said it's okay. We can create a document, but that's up to you to decide.
I mean, if we can do that, great. I mean, we'll just create a document and people will enter their names, and that's good. I'll just set out at the end. I mean, I do need a little time at the end to talk about also workload and some of the syllabi stuff. Okay, but let me maybe just wrap this up, because I mean, there's obviously more here that I can get into right now. But let's just try to do a basic rundown of a few central points, okay? So like Plato first, right? Okay, we got that. Now, Aristotle continues very similar to Plato, and we're gonna that's gonna be week 2. We're gonna look into this juncture, and we're gonna look at how the subject is defined, both in continuity and in exception to the natural world, and the basic rift that we normally attribute to the distinction between Platonism and naturalism that occurs in the distinction between Plato and Aristotle, and in their doctrine of the soul. Aristotle distinguishes between the irrational and rational parts of the soul, but he divides each of these parts into 2. The irrational part is composed of the vegetative part and the appetitive sides, and the rational part is composed of the passive and active intellects, as we call them. The passive intellect is the way in which our unconscious mechanisms for memorization and like what's going on right now without us deliberately, actively thinking or saying or speaking, the way we remember, the way we unconsciously process information. Basically, that's what he calls the passive intellect. But the active intellect is us engaging in overt instances of reasoning and deliberative cognition. So it's very interesting because he describes that there's 3 forms of ensoulment. Souls plants have souls, but they of course only have irrational vegetative sides, whereas we also have a sensible soul, which is a soul that includes vegetative and appetitive sides because they have desires. And then we have the rational soul, which includes these 2 passive and active intellectual capacities. So this is very interesting because to have a soul and therefore to have agency and subjectivation does not just mean, and this is something very interesting, Aristotle is usually taken to say that to be a subject is to be a rational animal. And it's true, he says we are rational animals, but it's very interesting that he thinks that creatures have souls, just plants have souls, even if they have a much more restrictive capacity of expression and problem solving than we do. They are still subjects in some sense. They are still ensouled, right? Insofar as what? What is the minimal condition for ensoulment for Aristotle? It is something that engages in a kind of self-sustenant growth and decay. Nutrition, the fact that you search for nutrients to sustain yourself and that you die in this kind of like self-sustaining manner through a search for nutrients is enough to give you a minimal degree of ensoulment, of agency. So this is why the nutritive part of the soul is a soul after all. And as I mentioned to you, this is why, we can even, before creatures that have souls, every natural being in the world nevertheless evinces a kind of teleological structure. Even non-ensouled beings, rocks and stardust, has a teleological structure insofar as what defines them, their form, their essence, has nevertheless something that it ought to be and ought to become, a telos as it is called. This is the 4th kind of causation that Aristotle defines it. So it's a very interesting thing where, very strange in Aristotle, normativity is more primitive than subjectivity. And ensoulment and subjectivity is more primitive than rationality or deliberative cognition. Whereas we tend to think today, especially after Kant, that normativity and discursive cognition are one and the same, and that subjectivity is equal to discursive cognition in the Kantian sense. In the Aristotelian sense, subjectivity precedes already, ensoulment precedes rational cognition, and normativity is more primitive than ensoulment even, because teleology is part of a natural kind. It's kind of a crazy thing to actually read Aristotle in this way. It makes Aristotle seem far more insane than he's usually taken to be, who is like the boring guy. Yeah? He isn't. He's insane. Anyway, and in the modern period, of course, like I was mentioning, the account of the subject was part of the development of the long and difficult saga between in contentions between the so-called rationalist and empiricist school. It was the rationalist school that famously produced the quote-unquote mind-body dualist picture of the human subject and defined the mind as the ego cogito. As we know, this is the Cartesian conquest or Cartesian invention, as it were. But we also here have in the rationalist tradition the conception of Spinoza, for example, who produces this quote unquote pantheistic notion of substance as subject and substance as God, where in fact thinking becomes an attribute of substance, and we are modes that express this attribute, modes being individuals in nature that express this attribute of substance alongside another attribute, which is extension. So as we all probably know, those of us who have read a little bit of Spinoza, what Spinoza does, he embeds the mind-body dualism, which for Descartes defines us intrinsically as individual human beings, into a substance monist ontology in which nature and God are one and the same, and thinking and extension are attributes of this single substance, right? Us being modes that express these attributes, extension and thinking. But substance has an infinity of attributes, and so subjectivity, interestingly for Spinoza, comprises not just a series of discrete faculties, for example, thinking, sensibility, and so on. It encompasses an infinity of attributes. We express two of them, but there's an infinity of them that substance as infinite expresses in its own way. So there we go. So this is a conception of a pretty macrocosmic conception of nature and the subject as the same, right? And as equiprimordial at the same time. We also have on the side of empiricism, I mean, and I could have gone on to Leibniz and so on and so forth, but let's just cut it short there. The Humean notion of the subject, of course, is one in which we are essentially contractual, habitual creatures that form ideas by this agency or unique faculty called the imagination, which takes sensory inputs, which he calls simple impressions or impressions, and combines them into forming ideas. So this combinatorial power is part of the imagination for Hume, and this is what generates the subject. You are essentially a creature that combines sensory impressions and forms ideas through the imagination. Now, as we probably all know, this rift leads into the Kantian picture of the subject as the transcendental subject, which is essentially a series of apperceptive unity or synthesis of various faculties. In essence, sensibility and the understanding through the mediation of the imagination, which is a whole clusterfuck there that I won't get into right now. But essentially, we are a unified subject that is a synthesis of sensible inputs, which is the passive side of sensibility, the forms of space and time, and the understanding, which is our conceptual categorical faculties to interpret the world and judge it constitutively. So the synthesis of two produce cognition or representation, and we are essentially creatures that represent the world. We are representational beings. And the definition of these capacities, the sensory and understanding, is what constitutes the concept of the subject as a transcendental inquiry into the conditions of possibility of all experience. That's just reiterating Kant 101. Now this leads into famously this modern saga up to Kant leads to two very brutal forms of skepticism. The Humean skepticism is a skepticism concerning nature and our knowledge of nature. Hume worries, and this is what's famously called the problem of induction, claims that because we form extrapolations and ideas out of contractions that we sense in the world, our notions of causal regularity and causal necessity that obtain in order to ground the concept of natural law, the fact that A therefore B is a matter of necessary occurrence, is in fact an extrapolation that's epistemically illegitimate. Long story short, we have no grounds epistemically to justify the necessity of natural laws. The necessity or natural necessity, or what is called in more contemporary jargon, objective modality, is an extrapolation from habit and an illegitimate extrapolation from that. So this leads to a first kind of skepticism that extends not only to the laws of nature, but concepts that require modally robust conceptions of subsistence and necessity, such as personal identity and others. But this is the first kind of skepticism, the Humean skepticism generated in the empiricist key. There's also, of course, a quote-unquote transcendental skepticism, which is the Kantian variety. Kant famously claims we cannot know the world as it is, or things in themselves, because everything we know is mediated by our sensory faculties and our conceptual faculties. Therefore, we only have access to the being of phenomena, to things as represented, things as they appear to us, not as they are in themselves. But this creates, of course, this massive result, which is that even natural science, the most rigorous of sciences, our mathematical knowledge of the physical world in the wake of modern physics and everything else, pertains only to the domain of appearance. It is a correlate of our subjective synthesis to represent the world, that represents the world. These principles do not apply to noumenal mind-independent reality. So there is a strict codependence between nature and the subject. Nature is nature as it appears for the subject. Nature is a subjective, it's a product of subjective synthesis. And the study into nature is a study into the representations that the subject yields. So this is why Kant's inquiry is an attempt to escape from Humean skepticism, but in turn generates this secondary form of skepticism concerning our knowledge of mind-independent reality. And in response to this, the 19th century unleashed a huge variety of responses that attempted to escape from these quote-unquote forms of skepticism and idealism, and this kind of transcendental skepticism and idealism generated by the Kantian variety. And here we have a wide variety of options. We have the Hegelian notion where nature becomes subject, and which of course retrieves knowledge of the absolute, that tries to diffuse the quote-unquote instrument or medium conception of reason, and therefore the critical account in favor of a speculative dialectical conception of the subject as substance and substance as subject. I mean, this is all jargon for those of you who know Hegel. If you don't worry too much, because you will not learn Hegel from me saying a sentence or two, but it's just, you know, to clear the air. But there's also the Schellingian transcendental materialist sort, which is kind of interesting. I think this is like a successor to the Spinoza's kind of pantheistic conception of nature as self-causing, but also as expressive, and also a predecessor in a way to both Bergson and Deleuze's transcendental empiricism, where the subject emerges from nature, and when nature itself is considered to be a kind of subject, but not in an properly idealist key in the sense that Hegel conceives of it, but as part of what he calls a transcendental physics. And we're going to be reading some of Schelling, who I've only now started to explore, and it's pretty rad. We have almost 10 minutes to go, so I'm going to stop very soon. And after these, these basic immediate answers, which are part of German idealism, we see a variety of conceptions of the subject try to basically go beyond the Kantian solution in the form of vitalist, panpsychist, and even neo-Kantian naturalist forms of answers to the Kantian predicament and account. Neo-Kantianism attempted to reconcile the investigation into the invariant conditions of possibility of experience with emergent insights in the 19th century, both in evolutionary biology, but also in the social sciences, and for example, the science of psychology. So how it is that we can quote unquote naturalize Kant. And this neo-Kantian project or saga finds itself reiterated in the 20th century, for example, in the Solarsian school, with, in which, for example, we see attempts to once again escape the idealist and skeptical conclusions generated by Kant's critical methodology within a new kind of naturalist framework. And I don't need to tell you that in the 19th century also we saw the birth of a wide variety of what is called, in the terms of Robert Brandon, genealogical critiques of Enlightenment rationality, but more broadly, modern conceptions of subjectivity, paradigmatically by Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx, who claim that underneath the whole fabric of deliberative cognition that rationalist philosophers paradigmatically up to Kant, and even Hegel, of course, thought as the characteristic of subjectivation, there lie these causal forces that are, in fact, hidden from view from how it is that we are. So, you know, perhaps paradigmatically, right? Freud describes it. We are not actually, we do not have privileged access to our own subjectivity because our ideas, our beliefs, our desires are mediated by a series of developmental psychosomatic factors, and that are, strictly speaking, imprinted into our psyche, but not directly accessible through introspective cognition, as it was for Descartes in the mode of a kind of transparent self-examination into your internal milieu. You don't have access. It's not only that we do not have access to how things are out there, we do not even have access to ourselves. We do not know ourselves. And this, of course, is going to lead in the 20th century, after Freud, for example, in Lacan, in the work of Lacan, to a re-elaboration of the concept of the subject, but through precisely the insights of Freudian psychoanalysis and in a structuralist register. I'm not going to get into that right now, obviously we don't have time. And then I wanted to just like, this is the last thing I wanted to say, is like in the 20th century, we saw two big vectors that I distinguished in my research, also in response to the Kantian sort of transcendental paradigm. There were those thinkers who proposed to radicalize critique in continuity with the neo-Kantian attempt to sort of retake the spirit of Kantianism in the wake of new social sciences and natural sciences, but moving this beyond perhaps even the naturalist framework in which neo-Kantianism was embedded. And here you find the examples of Heidegger, Husserl. Husserl was still working within the quote-unquote psychologistic framework indebted to Brentano. But then we move slowly towards an investigation towards different constitutive conditions of access to the world, which are transcendental, but not representational or even evolutionary or psychological, historical, textual, political, you name it, right? So things like deconstruction, existentialism, historicism, things that I mentioned before. So in this regard, we see that the subject is not only separated from the empirical self, as it already was for Kant, but it becomes progressively the fulcrum of all these kinds of mediations that go, strictly speaking, beyond the cognitive or the rational, right? And this is why there's an emphasis on embodied cognition, on textual, cultural, historical mediation, and so on and so forth. But there are those who turned their back on the transcendental project altogether, who wanted to say that transcendental philosophy and this kind of perpetual investigation into the conditions of access to the world, right, and into the universe is limited, and they wanted to overcome the critical paradigm. And this yielded new materialist and oftentimes naturalist answers that attempted to localize the subject as part of nature, or in exception to nature in any case, but without having to undergo a transcendental propedeutic. So here you see things like, for example, Bergson's, like, you know, vitalist metaphysics in the 20th century. Also, you can see something like, you know, the dialectical materialist account of someone like the early Badiou. I mean, now he has a transcendental framework as part of his theory of the object, but never mind that. In other words, attempts to diffuse transcendental propedeutic to metaphysics or ontology in the name of precisely positive philosophy. And in the case, for example, of Bergson, this leads into overtly into a kind of naturalist ontology that sidesteps the necessity for a quote-unquote transcendental problematic of access or the conditions of access to experience. And in this context, in the overcoming of critique, as I call it, you see different sort of conceptions of the subject emerge. Revolutionary conceptions of the subject that seem aligned with the romantic conceptions of the subject as really rare, genius, but also naturalist options, like, for example, Deleuze's quote-unquote transcendental empiricism, which disseminates subjectivity all throughout nature in his account of larval subjectivation. Now, Deleuze is a finicky case because he is operating in a transcendental framework in difference and repetition, but we are going to see how he ontologizes this directly. So in a certain way, short-circuiting the distinction between a transcendental propedeutic to metaphysics and metaphysics. Metaphysics becomes transcendental itself, kind of like it does for Schelling. And this is a way to overcome the critical paradigm in a quote-unquote sublation of it, but not, strictly speaking, in the Hegelian way, right? I have one more slide to show, but I don't want to get into that because it would take me far astray, which is about the analytic tradition. Voila. Yes, I can wrap it up. I mean, we have 5 minutes still, right?
I think we started like, I don't know, between 5 and 10 minutes after, like, so you can like make your final, you know, the things you said you still had to do, but I think we probably don't have enough time for questions.
Maybe a couple comments or anything. I mean, we have four minutes, so anything that anybody wants to throw in there quickly. I mean, I only have a couple of things to say as a matter of logistics. Nicked?
There was like a small question from before from Will H, who asked, will we engage specifically with the politics in the sense of subjection as the target of the concept of the subject? Was like, that was the question.
I hadn't conceived of that as explicitly as the topic. I mean, that would be subjection, the subjection of the subject or something. That would be a collateral topic. Yes, we will, but indirectly. And when we read both the Deleuzian anarchic and the Badiouian early theory of the subject, we see how this conception is woven to notions, strictly speaking, Marxist register, in which those questions become pressing. And that will be the one point in which that kind of question emerges in particular. But I'm more than happy to talk about that as well as we move forward. So that's my short answer to that. Any other questions or comments?
Maybe a short one. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
I looked on the Drive folder and saw that some of the readings weren't uploaded yet.
Yes. There's a couple.
Is there a reason for that, or?
Yes. There's a couple of readings that I'm just waiting to grab a hold of. But everything for the readings for next week, they are online and they're easy to get. They're like universally accessible. So I'm just going to be sending you a link. So a lot of them won't be files uploaded to the folder, just a link that I sent through email. And then the rest of them will be able. But yeah, because I don't have access to the libraries right now because of COVID, I'm having to get some of the stuff that I'm getting has to be scanned by friends or gotten to me, and I'm just completing some of the stuff that's missing. But that will be there in short notice.
Great, thank you.
Any final questions? And then I'll just say a few words about the workload. Okay, so long story short, very simple, extremely simple in fact. So there's a presentation and a paper, right? And so far, papers have been rather leniently distributed and assigned in this in the seminars that I've been, but it's going to be a little bit. I mean, considering the size of the class and considering my obligations, I'm going to have to be a little bit more strict about timelines. So you know, it will have to be. I can't just, you know, what happened last time is I got papers like 4 months later, things like that. And normally that's fine if I only have a few, but with 20 people in, it's going to be impossible, and I have other obligations. So a paper that's going to be anywhere between 10 and 15 pages, it doesn't have to be any longer than that, concerning any of the topics in the class, but you can also take it in your own direction, connecting these topics to your own interests, readings, and so on. Basically, I give you a lot of freedom. If you want to run it by me, I'm more than happy to do so. And the presentation, basically, we're going to send a document where you're just gonna like book yourself in. We're going to have, since well, we have like about 20 people, we're gonna have to have a couple of them per week. So try not to. So if there's 2 per week, that should do plenty. But don't try to book if there's already 2 names booked for a week. Okay, let's do it 2 per limit per week for the moment, and then we'll fill in the remaining blanks. That's number 1. And about the presentations, basically what we want is something. It doesn't have to be summary of the materials that we're dealing with for that week. You can either do a commentary or take it into your own turf, do something that sort of uses the readings that we did as a platform for you to engage in a kind of exegetical commentary. Do it whatever you want, basically. But that's what I'm saying. You can take it in whatever. Only be mindful of time. We have a lot of cover, and we're a big class, and I want us to have more time for discussion normally. So we have to be mindful that we need to cover the material that we're going to be assigning. Okay, and the readings are very difficult. Many of them are, and so those of you who do not have philosophical training might need help or might not understand some stuff. if you have any problem, just write to me an email and say, hey, I'm having issues understanding such and such term or such and such point. Probably the hardest thing we're going to be reading is the Piccinini and then Deleuze, because Deleuze is unintelligible, but it's awesome. And then other than that, I think it's got to be hard, but manageable. Any questions about this? Yeah. Okay. So I'm very sorry. I mean, we're already 1 minute past, but sorry for having to rush through things. But of course, we had a lot of introductions to do, and it's a large class. Welcome everybody. I'm happy to have such a diverse group. A lot of familiar faces and unfamiliar ones too. And it's got to be good. It's got to be good stuff for sure.
Thanks, Daniel. Then I'll finish the recording here, and then we can create, like, I'm going to talk to you, like, so I can create a document to organize the presentations. Okay.
Yeah, great, fantastic.
I'll send it to everyone.
Oh, and by the way, everybody, just remember that the latest version of the syllabus is uploaded into the drive now. So if you have an older version, re-download it. This one's corrected without any of the stupid typos and with the corrected readings and everything.
Yeah, and if anyone hasn't had access to the drive yet, get in touch, because there was someone who hadn't gotten it, so maybe there's someone else. So okay, if everything is okay, I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. See you next week.
Bye.
Can I just ask you quickly, Daniel? I didn't want to take any time during the class.
No, sure,
do you have access to the Wolfendale Backer exchange that you?
Yes. So
yeah.
Yes, I do have it, but I have to ask for permission. That's
okay.
The one thing. So I'm still in the process of like sweetening both parties up.
Yeah, I was just really interested in, sort of curious about what that was going to be about. So.
It is fantastic. It's a fantastic correspondence, but I have to edit some things out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Yeah. Okay.
Have a nice week, everyone.
You too.